I'm here today with Kenneth W. Wheeler, author of a new book titled U.S., The Resurrection of American Terror. Ken is a retired ELCA pastor. He and his wife, Gloria, are parents of 3 adult sons and grandparents to 5 amazing grandchildren. And you can subscribe to Ken on Substack at kennethwwheeler.substack.com. So welcome, Ken, and congratulations on your new book.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm honored to be with you today.
Well, same here. You know, I've been looking forward to this for quite some time because we've been communicating by email and Facebook, and we're finally getting a chance to do an interview. And I really have been looking forward to that, and also look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
So maybe to get started, what else would you like people to know about you besides what I very briefly touched on?
Well, I think it's always important to know. It's always important to tell my story in terms of where I grew up. I was born in I was born in Vicksburg, Mississippi, in 1952. So I was born in the last vestiges of Jim Crow segregation. So I grew up in that. Milieu. Lived in it for 17 years until I went away to college. My mother was a devout Christian. And one of the things that I remember about my mother is that she was a prayerful woman. And in fact, there were many, many mornings that I was awakened from sleep by my mother praying. And she always sat at the kitchen table with her Bible in front of her because she had read certain scriptures, and she loved the Psalms. And so she would read the Psalms quite frequently, but then she would end that kind of devotional piece with a stirring prayer. And it was stirring. It was, you could feel the presence of God in that tiny 4-room house that we lived in on Kennington Avenue. And so I was impacted as a child and as a teen by Jim Crow segregation, but I was also impacted by the faith of my mother. That faith that carried me through those difficult times when it was easy for me, when I toyed with anger and bitterness and hatred. But it was that faith. It was hearing my mother pray to this God that she believed was a God of justice and a God of love. And that message got deep down on the inside of me.
And so after you went away to college, you also went to seminary and you became a pastor. So can you tell folks a little bit about your career as a preacher?
Yes, I was ordained in 1982, a graduate of Trinity Lutheran Seminary in Columbus, Ohio. My first call was to a tiny little church in Jacksonville, Florida. I was the only African-American ALC, American Lutheran Church pastor of color in the state of Florida. So I was in this church for 18 months. It was a church that was about 25 years old. It started as a white congregation. I was the 7th pastor of this church, and that should tell you something about what kind of struggles they had gone through. But I think it was a church. It was challenging. In fact, I was challenged to a degree where I wrestled with God about whether or not I had made the right decision to enter ministry. I resigned that congregation in about 18 months, and so I was without call for about a week because between the time that I resigned and the time that I took my second call, I was approached by 3 congregations, one in New York, one in Alabama, Mobile, Alabama, and one in Los Angeles. And I interviewed at the church in Los Angeles, and took that call. I was there for 3 years. It was at one point the largest Black Lutheran church on the West Coast. Its first pastor was Nelson Trout, and Nelson Trout is and remains an icon within Lutheranism. He was one of my seminary professors. He was the pastor who ordained me, and he was the pastor who installed me at the church that he had served in Los Angeles, Community Lutheran Church.
Wow.
That church grew and in a sense restored my faith in my ability as a pastor. When I interviewed there, the numbers looked almost like the church in Jacksonville. In fact, my wife said, "Oh, this doesn't feel good." And I remember at the interview, I asked the leadership, "So what are your hopes and your dreams as you move ahead?" And they answered, we want to grow again, and we want to become financially independent again. And so the operative word there was again, because they knew what growth and vitality looked like. They had been there. They knew what financial independence looked like because they had been there. When I started, there were 30 people worshiping, and in 6 months we had 121 people worshiping.
Wow.
And in 3 years we had a membership of close to 400. And not just with people who were on the rolls. The church was filled to capacity every Sunday. It just was it was an amazing and a powerful ministry. And then from there, I took a call to Milwaukee, and I served a congregation there for about 2 years until I was invited by the bishop to serve on his staff as an assistant. And I served as an assistant to Peter Rockness for about 15 years. And then after Peter left, the bishop who followed him asked if I would remain on the staff, and I did. I was with him for about 3 years until I chose to go into a parish in Milwaukee. Historically, it had been a place of great challenge, great transformation. It was one of the first churches in the area to welcome people who were gay and lesbian. And I went there as an interim because they had some issues. And one Sunday, I think I was told that 40 people got up and walked out of a Sunday service because they didn't like what the pastor was saying. I got to know that pastor, and I think he was a person who simply was prophetic in many ways, and he said some hard things, and there were people who couldn't hear those hard things. But nonetheless, I went there as an interim. I was there for about 6 months before people began to ask, "Why can't you stay?" And I said, because I was not called to be your pastor. I was called to be an interim, and I had a particular assignment. But then I would hear that almost every Sunday, someone would come up to me and say, "Pastor, God has prepared this place for you. You need to reconsider." And eventually I did. And so that's the church that I served for 8 years before retirement. But it was an amazing place. We got to walk with people who were on the margins every day. People who were struggling with issues of addiction, people who were homeless. The poverty rate in that area, 60% of Black males in that area were unemployed.
Wow.
And so And so we began to think about how we might address that issue as a congregation. And we ended up starting the jobs ministry, which I'm proud to say that ministry is still going strong.
Wonderful. Wow, how
Yeah,
important.
yeah,
So let's get to the book. As I mentioned, the title is U.S. or Us, U.S. I'm sorry, U.S. The Resurrection of American Terror. What inspired you to write the book?
yeah. When Donald Trump ran for president in 2015, um, I was deeply troubled by some of the things that he said uh, racially, his disrespect and disregard for women, um, his not only claim of white supremacy, but his embrace of that, his refusal to even denounce or step away from David Duke, who had been a grand wizard of the KKK, and Trump sort of embraced that initially. Um, so I was troubled by that, but even more so, I was troubled by the fact that 81% of white evangelicals voted for him, and I began to think, what was that about? It was clearly what kind of God were they worshiping? And it took me back to growing up in Mississippi, in Jackson, where I'd heard people like Ross Barnett, who was the governor of Mississippi at the time, and Alan Thompson, who was the mayor of Jackson at the time. I'd heard those people say far worse things racially than Donald Trump ever dreamed of saying. At least he didn't say them in public. But what was when he won the presidency, what I was probably most offended by was that he embraced this ideology of white supremacy and he brought that into the White House. He made that a political agenda. And as he did that, he separated Americans in a way that we had not been separated in a very long time. And so I was troubled by that. And I think the insurrection that we witnessed in 2020 at the White House, at the Capitol, all of that, I think I lay at the feet of Donald Trump. And there is no way in God's name that his presidency or his candidacy, in my mind, could ever square with the Jesus of the Gospels, which is the Jesus that I know. And it was the Jesus that my mother prayed to. And so I thought I need to not just write a blog, and I've written a lot on my blog about that, but I needed to share this in a much larger arena. And so writing a book was the way to do that.
Wow. Well, I've done interviews with, other people like Frank Thomas and Susan Smith, that have written, similar kinds of books and had similar kind of experiences that they just so detested what happened and what's happening in our country and had a similar kind of need to write about it and very powerfully, just as you have. What, you kind of touched on a couple of this, but what are some of the memories of, when you did grow up in the 50s and 60s in Jackson, Mississippi, with the kind of racial environment that existed then? I mean, because a lot of us, were unaware of that or blind to that.
Yeah. Let me say this. So Jim Crow meant that we lived separate from one another as black and white people. That's the essence of Jim Crow. And so I grew up on the north side of Jackson in a community that was referred to as Georgetown. All of the people, which was comprised of about 8 streets. And so I walked those streets. I knew the people that lived on those streets. They were my neighbors. They knew me. They knew my parents. They knew me by name. They knew my parents by name. In that setting, I always felt safe. I felt protected. It was only when you walked outside of the Georgetown community that you had to be concerned about your safety, right? And that meant that if I went downtown, and normally if I did go downtown, I would go with my cousins or friends. I never went alone. And it was always interesting because both my father and my mother would say to me, they would always say to me, and I think other parents in the community would say to their children, be careful, be careful, be careful. And at some point I thought, why do I need to be careful? I know the people and they know the people in the Georgetown community. I don't have any reason to be afraid of them, but they were thinking of the larger context. And so I was born in 1952. 3 years later, Emmett Till was brutally killed. Every Black mother and every Black parent knew the story of Emmett Till. And so when my mother would say to me, son, be careful, just be careful. I think she had in her mind the story of Emmett Till. I tell the story in the book about probably one of the most vivid memories that I had as an 8-year-old child. My mother and I had gone to work with her on a Saturday. And so we took a bus back to the Georgetown community. But my mom said, son, I'm going to take you to the zoo. And so we took the bus from East Capitol to West Capitol. The zoo and the bus stopped right in front of the zoo. We got off, bought our tickets, went inside, and we'd seen a couple of displays. It was hot because it was in July, and it was very hot. And if you've ever been to Mississippi in the summer, in July and August, you know that heat is brutal, not just hot, but it's also humid. And so my mom, there was an ice cream stand that was close. And so my mom said, son, let's just have some ice cream. And so she bought a cone of vanilla for her, and then she bought a double cone of strawberry for me because she knew that I loved strawberry. And so we had packages because my mom had stopped to shop, and we sat on this park bench, and it may have been 5 minutes. It may have been less than that, but 5 minutes. And this white police officer came over, and he raised his voice to my mother and said to her, don't you see this white woman and her son who want to sit down? And of course, we had not seen them. And so then he proceeds to jerk my mother from the park bench. So her ice cream fell on the pavement. And he called her the N-word. And here I am. I got up. My ice cream fell because I was trying to keep my mother from falling over. And so my mom was in tears. I began to pick up some of the stuff that was on the ground, the packages that were on the ground. There were both white people and Black people around watching all of this, and no one said a word. Not one person came over to see if we were okay. And as we began to walk home, we were it was hot. We only lived about maybe less than a half a mile from the zoo, but we walked. And I had my mom's free hand, and I looked up at her and I said, "Mom, you don't ever have to take me to the zoo again. If I want to see an animal, I will watch on television National Geographic." And so we walked home, and that was the only word spoken. We walked home. By the time we got home, we were both soaking wet. And I remember that I looked up at my mom at one point, and the tears were just flowing, but she never said a word. And the next morning came, Sunday morning, the next morning came, and I could hear my mom praying. And then she was in the kitchen making breakfast. She had called, we were going to leave for church like at 10 that morning. She had called a cab. I did not feel like going to church because the memory was still, at 8 years of age, that memory was still in my mind. And
Sure.
But my mother never said a word. The only thing she said was, "Son, God will take care of that." So at 8 years of age, that was my first real memory of the ugliness of Jim Crow segregation. I had mixed feelings about white people. I had mixed feelings about white police officers. And the system, and this is, I think as I was writing this book, that white supremacy is larger than white people, right? And it's larger than Black people. It's a system that began as a thought, that developed into an ideology, that became a culture, and we are wrapped in this thing that is bigger than we are, right? I can only I don't know what that white police officer felt, other than the fact that he thought that he was doing his job. And his job was to maintain Jim Crow at all cost, right? But it was dehumanizing. Yeah.
Wow. Well, one of the things you wrote was that, 15 years ago, I began to write again in an effort to unpack my own anger and why I chose to remain silent in the face of a system whose only goal was to humble and crush my humanity. So, I mean, that what you just shared was, an example of that.
Yeah.
How has the process of writing, I guess, helped deal with the anger, the justifiable anger that you have to have felt?
Yeah, I think it's, it was cathartic for me, right? And so when people say, and my mom said too, "Son, you can't let anger kill you," and she was right about that. But I don't think that I ever felt that it was appropriate to deny anger, right? And underneath that anger is loss. It's grief. We were robbed of our humanity day in and day out. And what I saw happen to my mother at that zoo, and what happened to me at that zoo, was very traumatic. Although at 8 years of age, I didn't have any of that vocabulary in my head. I just knew that what happened was not right. It was unjust. But begin to write about that is to, in a sense, begin to release that anger. Because when Donald Trump was president, and there were people who referred to him as 45. I never referred to him as 45 because I think to refer to him as 45 would be to rob him, to strip him of his humanity. I didn't like his humanity, but he was a human being. I recognize that he was a human being created in the image of God, just as I was created in the image of God. And if I was not able to recognize his humanity, then I would become just like him. And that is not what I wanted to be. Right.
Wow. So here's another quote that you wrote. I believe the truth is the key to creating a better America, an America that's more just, more equal, and more humane. And, my feeling is that our country has become seriously disconnected with the truth in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
Which, just like so many intractable problems, you say, what can we do about it?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on what we can do about it?
Well, I think we have to just simply say that not everybody is going to ever get on the same page, right? And so James Baldwin says in one of his books, and he's writing about race, and he says, I believe, and I would echo Mr. Baldwin, I believe that for consciously aware whites and consciously aware blacks and Asians and Latinos and all of those who are non-white, to recognize that truth is the only way that we're going to get out of this malaise that we find ourselves in. You cannot manufacture truth, right? And I think that's what Donald Trump was so good at, manufacturing and fabricating truth that was really not truth. But I think that there has to be, and this is where I think the Christian church has a responsibility. No Christian church or no church that calls itself Christian can embrace a lie. And clearly what Donald Trump and Trumpism represents is a lie. White supremacy is a lie. I think we have to be able to say that in our congregations. We have to be able to say that to our membership, even if that membership finds what we say reprehensible, right? And so I talk about Jeremiah, the prophet. God is angry with the nation because he says the nation has wounded my people and yet has treated the wound as if it is not serious. And so white supremacy is a wound, and it's serious, and it has not only impacted Black people and people of color and made our lives and created a misery for us. I believe that white supremacy also dehumanizes white people. And you mentioned, the death of George Floyd, which we all watched. The world watched that. When Emmett Till was killed, I read about that. I didn't witness that, right? I read about his death through Ebony magazine at first, and then other writings. But with George Floyd, my wife and I watched that video over and over and over again from our living room. And I said to my wife at one point, when Derek Chauvin had his knee on the neck of George Floyd, and he turned to the camera with this almost devilish smile, I said to my wife, he has lost his humanity, because no human being would dare do what Derek Chauvin did to George Floyd.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He lost his humanity. What does white supremacy do? It robs you of your humanity. White supremacy, Jim Crow segregation, robs people of their humanity.
Mm.
Right?
Very true. Very true. So, who would you most like to read your book? Who's would you say is most intended for?
Well, I think clearly I'm writing to white America. I'm writing particularly, especially the white Christians. I'm writing to white Lutherans. I've served in the Lutheran Church for 30 years as an ordained pastor. This is the church that that I was called to serve. I've been a part of this church for over 40 years. This is my church. It's the church that I love, but it's a church that also has embraced and that has been impacted by institutional racism. And so I'm writing to my church. I'm writing to the white members of my church. But I'm also writing for folks of color. I'm writing as one who believes that my story is not just my story alone, but that I'm speaking for other folks of color who may feel at the moment that they're not able to speak as clearly, as profoundly, as with such loudness as I'm speaking.
Mm.
Yeah.
So the book was published by Precocity Press. Can you tell us a little bit about them and how you found them?
Yeah, I was there was a pastor that I had met in Los Angeles. Actually, I preached at his church, United Methodist pastor in Los Angeles. I was invited to preach at his church a couple of years ago, and he had written a book entitled Alabama Grandson, and it was about his dealing with his own sexuality, but he used Precocity Press, and so as I was thinking about how I was going to have this thing published, because folks have said self-publishing is a way to go. Others had talked about the larger publishing companies. But I knew that my name was not Barack Obama, so I knew that I would not be able to get through that door. And then someone said, maybe you should go the independent publishing route. Well, I ended up emailing Pastor Cedric Bridgeford, because he had just had this book published by Precocity Press. I messaged him one night, and within 5 minutes, he messaged me back, and he said, I would be more than happy to introduce you to Susan Shanken. 5 minutes later, there was an email from Susan.
Wow.
Saying that we'd love to talk with you. We'd love to work with you. We'd love to publish your book. So it's an independent publishing company. They have been amazing to work with. And I think, as I said to you earlier, I had an editor, both the editor and the publisher. The editor, Sarah Vole, a young white woman, and then Susan, both had read all of my blog posts and Kenneth's musings. And so they came to the conversation with an understanding on some level of who I was, and what my soul looked like. Yeah.
Wow. So are there pieces from your book that you'd like to read?
Sure. There are two sections. One is in the introduction, and I'm speaking about the January 6th insurrection. I was watching America on the 6th of January, 2021, when white insurrectionists stormed the United States Capitol, carrying both the American flag and the Confederate flag. I saw the noose, a symbol of such racial terror, that had been erected on the Capitol grounds, although ostensibly intended as a threat on the life of a white man. In conjunction with the Confederate flag, the underlying message of racial intimidation was clear. I saw a number of these white insurrectionists kneeling to pray before they entered the building to vandalize property, do violence, and ultimately kill over half a dozen people. I wondered who those insurrectionists were. I wondered what God they were praying to. As a Christian and as an ordained Lutheran pastor, I knew that we were not praying to the same God. And then near the end of the book, this is from the chapter on repentance and reparations. And I began by mentioning this Zulu word, sawubona, which literally means, I see you. I wrote this book knowing that we have not seen each other as Black and white people in this nation, and also knowing that this seeing is achievable if we have courage enough to tear down this wall that has divided us for centuries. To be able to see, to be able to look at one another when we meet each other and know that there is something that neither race nor color can ever rob from us. And this is something that I know deeply and that I have felt deeply. What it cannot rob from us is the humanity that we share. When Jesus asked his disciples, who do people say I am? Their multiple answers revealed their confusion. Jesus is asking us to see him with his wounds and with his scars, to see him as the human being that he is and that he's calling us to be. In these pages, I have set a place at a table where we can meet as human beings, beloved children of God who are created in God's image. I believe we are capable of seeing each other as God sees us. But the work of tearing down the structures of white supremacy must be the first work that we are committed to. We must be diligent about that work. We are all under threat in a nation where there are more guns than people. And yet Black people and people of color will always face this threat much more profoundly.
Wow. Those are both powerful pieces. Thank you for sharing those. So I know you just came out with this book, and that was, a long labor of love to create that. But I have to ask you, are there any future books that you may want to do as a follow-up?
Yeah, I think so. I think I said to you earlier that I'm in a place of kind of resting and being refreshed at the moment, because this book took a lot out of me. Not that the writing was difficult, but that I had to explore some emotional stuff, and that's always draining. It's always difficult. But yes, I believe that that there's probably at least another book in me. I'm still writing, and so I don't think the writing task will be. I think it will be easier the next time that I do this. But yeah, I'm always reading. I'm always writing, and I'm always thinking about what God has blessed me with in terms of being 70 years of age, and not just looking back, but also looking forward. And I look forward because we have grandchildren who are, this morning I woke up and I walked past their picture on the refrigerator, and it just brought a smile to my face. Yeah. So I want my grandchildren, our grandchildren, to grow up in a world where they will always be assured of their humanity and that they are beautiful people, that they're not somehow defective, because they're not. And so I want to write to help create that world for not just our grandchildren, but for all of the children who live in a precarious place at the moment.
Amen. Amen. Well, I'm glad to hear that you're going to do some more. I think, your first book is a really important contribution. I really hope it does well, but, I would love to see you do more too.
Thank you. Thank you.
So again, the new book is titled U.S., The Resurrection of American Terror. You can subscribe to Ken on Substack at kennethwwheeler.substack.com. Ken, it was so great to be able to spend some time with you. I really appreciate that, and best wishes in all of your endeavors.
Thank you, Brian, and I look forward to more time with you.